So when you write a book, I would argue probably the most difficult thing to do is nail down the title. And there is a lot of pressure from the publisher about the title. Sometimes they say pick the title first and write to that. I didn't. I wrote the entire book out and then spent a day trying to figure out what this title would be. And I went into the room where I write, and I was sitting there, and it goes, all right, what's the purpose of this book? What are these words really trying to say? Well, one of the main themes in the story is I'm looking for something. I'm looking for who I am independently of my last name and the bubble I grew up in. But I'm also sort of looking to get to a place of peace after the tragic passing of my father. So I'm kind of looking for this place. I'm looking for something. And then it hit me. I go, oh my gosh. One of the things my father used to say was look for me there. And the distinguished story was I was a little kid, and that's a good song. We got the Bee Gees. All right. Leading it in. I was in Baltimore as a young kid, and we would go to baseball games, Baltimore Orioles, which are right up 95 from D.C. And it was a very warm day, and we were walking together in a crowd. And he was holding my hand, and there's just a swarm of people, and we got separated. And I fell back about 10 feet, and he never lost sight of me, but the sort of crush of people took us away. And he came running back, and he put his arm around my shoulder, and he said, you know, if we're ever separated, just look for me there. And it was a hot dog stand with a big Oriole bird. But it always stuck with me, and I think that was just sort of was something that was very prevalent in the story and in my own life. It's kind of when you lose somebody you're super close with, who's just your best friend, who you love so much, you're kind of always looking for them in some capacity. And it came to me relatively quickly in this period of thinking about the title. And the first thing I did is I Googled it. I'm like, please don't let anyone else have that. Please don't let anyone else have it. And no one else had it. And before I told HarperCollins what the title was going to be, I bought the website right away. And so I got lookformethere.com. And they liked it, by the way. So they were very happy about that.
So tell us about your dad. Tell us about your relationship with him and what he was like as a dad. He was very prominent, very well known. What was that like?
He was an incredible father, and the thing that was incredibly special about my dad was that he gave what I think is the most important gift you can give to your kids, and that's time. And it was unstructured time. He always would try to show up to baseball games, soccer games, every day when he would come home from work, often working 12, 14-hour days, just dog-tired, would ask me about my homework, how my day was, would take an interest in my life over the dinner table every night with my mother. And so in that, it was a very much, this is Dad, this is not Tim Russert, moderator, Meet the Press. I think I was about 8 or 9 years old, and when I realized, I was like, not everyone's dad lives inside a little screen like mine does. And people would ask me about my father when I would go over on play dates and stuff like that. But you know, it was very different lives. It was this sort of idea of Dad versus Tim. And I was fortunate because I got to go around with him to different tapings and Meet the Press, and I loved to go on the road with him when he would take me, and he would do some cool things too, like go to spring training for baseball and just have to interview Derek Jeter, you know, because it's needed, right? And in that sense, I got to see his preparation because I saw it at home. He was very diligent, like you, legal pad. He was a trained lawyer. And then when it came time to do an interview, I could just sort of see the switch flip, and he would get locked in this space. And I really grew to appreciate that as a young man, which is, you know, you can have fun, but there is a level of responsibility, and then there's a time when you have to turn it on. But overall...
Was he generous with his time with you?
Yeah, very generous. And I think that is something where, looking back on it, you know, especially having worked in television, it's so stressful, and there's so many demands on your time, especially for him. He really was able to carve it out, and it wasn't done in a way of like, okay, I got 35 minutes for you in my schedule, you know, let's play with Legos. It was very natural, it was very organic, and I could always get through to him, which was great.
So I want to talk about the very first chapter of your book,
yeah.
and I would imagine this is probably still somewhat hard to talk about, but it's entitled June 13th, 2008.
Yeah.
Tell us what happened.
Well, it was a terrible day. I was actually in Florence, Italy, with my mother and my college girlfriend I was dating at the time, and we were towards the sort of end of this trip that was celebrating my graduation from Boston College. And my father had been with us for a portion of it, and actually I just was with him 2 days prior in Rome. The last day we ever spent together was actually at the Vatican. It was seeing, a prayer service led by the Pope at the time. And I got a call from his office, and I was at a bar watching a soccer match, and I said, "Oh, it's probably, he's probably looking for mom because he thinks mom is with me, and my mom's not the best at answering her phone." And so it comes up, and it was one of his assistants, and she said, "Can we talk to your mom?" I said, "Well, I'm not with her right now." I said, "Can I help you?" And she's sort of hedging, and she goes, "Well, it's just that your dad fainted." And I knew right then something was terribly wrong because he was such a workaholic. He prided himself on strength and stamina, and he would not faint. Then as the course of the next hour developed, sort of realized that he had passed away from a heart attack. And it's a surreal moment. You obviously are just hit with a tsunami of emotions. But what was super unique in that situation is there's so many people who felt the death, it was like a family member for them. So I look back on that period, and I'm actually really thankful my mom and I were in Italy. We were removed for about a day and a half, and that allowed us to have our own sort of private grieving process before a very national one took place, which was something that took me a long time to understand and wrap my head around.
So what I thought was interesting in the book is you talk about there was an intense pressure on their part back in Washington, D.C. to make sure you heard about this before it got out to the news.
Yeah, so his death is really right before social media comes into its own, and that was a time when next of kin were really supposed to be notified. If it had happened now, it would have been on Twitter in 2 seconds. But my mother, in the moment, was incredibly organized, and I just admire her to this day for it. And she's yelling on the phone like, "If this goes on TV before I am able to tell his family, I will never forgive you." And the news held, which is very impressive, until Tom Brokaw went on with a special report. But yeah, it was a very difficult day, and it made all the more so because anytime that you experience loss, it's hard. But when you have it in such a public manner with this, your mom, now a widow, is yelling on the phone, "Don't let this be breaking news on TV." That's a different element.
So there was a memorial service at the Kennedy Center.
Yeah.
There was a funeral at the Holy Trinity Church in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
It was attended by dignitaries and some of the most prominent politicians in the country. I think even Obama and McCain were there, and at that time they were presidential candidates. And you gave the eulogy. So tell us how that happened. You're 22, you're 3 weeks after graduating from college, and here you are giving the eulogy, the last speech in each of those places. And you can watch the Kennedy Center one on YouTube, and I would encourage you to see it. But why did you decide to do that, and how did you get prepared for that?
Well, my mother has said, she's like, "Well, who's going to do the eulogy?" And she just stopped mid-sentence and was like, "You're going to do the eulogy." I was like, "Okay." And it's surreal, right? And I remember opening up the computer and I titled it to center myself, "Dad's Eulogy," just so that hit. And where do you begin, right? Where do you begin? And I knew there was a lot of pressure riding on that, but in the writing process, I knew it had to be my own. I couldn't lean on anybody else to do it. And a friend of mine from college, he actually said, "Don't forget, in your dad's book, Big Russ and Me, there's a whole chapter on loss." I said, "That's right." And so I reread that chapter on loss, and there's a portion in there where it talks about, my father says, "Be thankful for the time you had," and he talks about a friend of his who lost a son, and he says, "If you said to me I could have 22 years with somebody as opposed to none at all, you would take that deal in a heartbeat." And that line registered with me. I said, I had 22 years of the most incredible dad. Let me celebrate that and focus in on that. And then I tried to make it a continuation, a little bit of what he would want said about him and his career, but also the role of being a dad. Which was way more of an important job than him from Meet the Press. But it was giving that eulogy that then launched me into this stratosphere, which was completely unexpected because that eulogy was carried on live TV.
So I have to tell you, and again, I really recommend you go on YouTube and watch it because you were composed. You were funny, you were serious, you were emotional. It really was amazing. So if it's okay, I want to read, this is on page 18. It's in the first chapter again. And it says, quote, "A group of TV executives find me afterward at a bar with my friends. The speech was great, they tell me, one of the best they've heard. I'd shown poise. They began that day and in the weeks that follow to talk about my future. That single eulogy, the remembrance, will change my career trajectory and my life. Out of my worst day will come my biggest opportunity." So what happened next?
So people saw that and they go, this is a young man, he's composed, he's got a great last name. This is an election where young people are very prevalent, in there. Why don't we put him on TV? And I was apprehensive about it at first because I was going through a grieving process. But then as I thought about it, I kind of was a big believer in things happen for a reason. And there's some times when you're kind of launched out like a rocket, and what do you really do with it in that moment? And I wasn't naive. I knew nepotism charges would be very heavy, and I knew that I was walking into somewhat of a snake pit. But I also knew that I had a perspective that a lot of people didn't. And I had a platform and I had a voice, and I wanted to see what I could do with it in that moment. And so the first offer was, cover youth stories around the election in 2008 and see what you do with it. And I did that, but once the inauguration came in 2009, it was, well, there's not a lot of youth voting stories anymore, so what are you going to do? And that's how I ended up on Capitol Hill, is that I was very bored, and I said, well, I don't want to sit here and collect a paycheck for nothing. That's just the opposite of what my father would have ever wanted. I said, we're short-staffed on Capitol Hill. Let me go do something. And they said, okay. And so I went up there and I covered these subcommittee hearings in the middle of the night that no one cared about, but I found fascinating, and got to my opinion, like a PhD in politics from studying these things. I loved it. People don't realize, but there's so many obscure things on Capitol Hill that really do set policy for generations. And I remember one of the first subcommittee hearings I ever attended was about, what shark species to put on the endangered species list from Maine to Massachusetts. And you're like, that's actually really interesting. So that started a real interesting love. And because I had the time, I would put in these incredible notes in the NBC internal system. A lot of people's notes were like, this happened, the senator said so-and-so. But mine had a lot of rich detail, and someone said, okay, why don't you just talk about your note on TV? And that's how it started into that next phase.
And was it always something successful in that sense, something that you enjoyed?
It's something. Growing up in the house I grew up in, I think journalism was kind of the family business. Being forward facing, I was an only child. I'm a Leo, like microphone in hand, liking to talk, gesticulate, being out there. But TV it's not for the faint of heart. And I always tell people that for what you see on a screen, there's so much that goes in behind the scenes, and especially in news, there's a lot of internal battles because there's turf wars, right? Everyone wants airtime, everyone wants to break news. You're competing against the stories, you're competing against your competitors at other organizations, you're also competing internally. And there was a lot of it that I liked, but there's a lot of it which, especially for a young man who just lost his father and was very unsure of who he was himself, it was a difficult thing to do simultaneously. But I never let anybody know that. I mean, part of what I talk in the book is I kept that all inside. You have to be young and strong and tough and all those things, and you don't want to admit weakness.
And how were you treated?
Pardon?
How were you treated?
So by some people I was treated very kindly. By others, I was the epitome that was everything that was wrong with TV. As a young heterosexual privileged white male, that's the problem. So it was, but I walked into it knowing that. I wasn't naive. I wasn't stupid. I think the only times where you get upset is when people would say something that's very cheap. It is a cheap shot and it's unfair. And if you wanted to grill me about my performance, that's fine. But once it gets into personal things, it's just like, come on, it's a punching bag. People, and I do go back to something, Theodore Roosevelt said about the man in the arena. I really do value people who work in television, and people who work in politics, who work in sports, who put themselves out there every single day and are failing in front of you. It's not easy to do that all the time.
So you've been there, I think, about 8 years, and you get, I think it's a phone call, or you happen to meet the Speaker of the House, John Boehner, and he summons you. I think, is that the right word? He kind of
Well, I had
summoned
covered him for a number of years, and so we knew each other, but we would pass each other in the hallway, and he said, I want to talk to you, come to my office. And Boehner is, a very interesting guy. And I had no idea why he wanted to see me. And so I go down to his office, and I walk in.
And you didn't go just to his office, did you?
No, I went to the ceremonial office. He was in the ceremony. That's a good detail, yes. It's the ceremonial office right off the House floor, and this is the office where he does the photo ops with prime ministers and the Pope, and it's a big deal. It's a lot of history in there. And I walk in, and Boehner is smoking a cigarette and reading Golf Digest. And I walk in, and he's like, "What are you doing here?" I'm like, "Well, you're the speaker. You had me here." And he goes, "What are you doing here?" And Boehner, like my father and myself, he's Jesuit educated. I'm like, "This is one of these Jesuit mind games. What are you doing here?" Right? And he goes, "No," he goes, "I've seen you on Capitol Hill." He goes, "You've been here about 7 years. You've been in D.C. your whole life. Like, is this really what you want to do?" And it struck me, and I said, "I'm sorry." I said, "Where's this sort of coming from?" He goes, "Well," he goes, "I see people in Washington. It's very transactional. It's always the next election or the next bill that has to be passed. And it's a very easy scene. There's all these lobbyists. There's all these free dinners and late nights and drinks and the whole 9 yards. Is this really what you want to do? Because it has a grip on you. It has a hold on you. And the older you get, the harder it is to leave. And would you be better served by going somewhere and striking out on your own for a little bit? Go learn a skill or go see something different." And it was really striking to hear this because Boehner had a similar upbringing to my dad. He was from a big Catholic family. He paid his way through school. He was the only member of his family to go to college. And on top of that, here is someone who, metaphorically and literally was on the top of the hill as the speaker. And he's saying the view from here is not all it's cracked out to be. And that just hit me. And so I had questions inside my head about whether or not this is really what I wanted to do. And that conversation kind of opened the door that was like, if the speaker's saying it's okay to get out of here, it might be worthwhile to explore that. And so that starts the process of maybe I should get out of here.
So tell us about that process. How did you go from really being thrust into the spotlight to then making a decision to dramatically change
It's
your
scary,
life?
because at first, the first thing I had to get over was this idea that I'm letting my dad down. Because part of the reason why I got into it was this is the destiny. This is a sort of legacy preservation in a way. Like I'm keeping that flame alive, not just for him, but for a lot of people. There's a lot of people who came up to me, especially early on. We see Tim's eyes in you. We see that persona in you. You bring us such comfort. It's good for us. But then the other component of it is, what happens after that when you leave the only thing that you've known? And I came from a good place. I knew I wasn't going to lose a roof over my head or anything like that. But in my own head, it was, I could be walking away from something and never be able to go back. And is this a real mistake? All these long hours I've spent, all these tough days that I've endured, just leaving it, is that the right decision? And I had to wrestle with that for a while.
So how did you decide to travel? That's one question. And then did this decision have something to do with you consciously saying, I haven't grieved for my father during these 8 years? How did those two fit together?
So the travel was, my mother was a Peace Corps volunteer, and she grew up in California. She grew up in Alameda, up in Northern California. And the first time she ever left home for a very long period of time was in the Peace Corps. And she always associated travel with learning about who you are at your core. Because when you're thrust into real travel, there's situations that are very much outside of your control, especially in different cultures, that you have to understand. So she would always say to me, you need to travel more. You've lived way too sheltered in a privileged bubble of life. Get out there beyond the world you know. So that was one component of it. The grieving process in the beginning, it wasn't so much there, because I think that's what I come to realize in the book. All these anxieties that I had, all these feelings that I had, where I was nervous, where I felt palpitations, where I didn't want to wake up in the morning sometimes. I didn't know where that was coming from. I thought that was just aging. And it turns out that hey, the fear of getting old, hey, it happens at 38. So
I'm afraid it doesn't go away.
It doesn't go away. But yeah, and so those things, and it wasn't until I realized that's grief, right? That you're shouldering that load. But at the time, it wasn't so much grief; it was more of just, who am I beyond this?
So it's interesting. In the book, you talk a lot about not failing your father, honoring your grandfather, and a lot about duty. Tell me what that is, and maybe it ties into your tattoo also.
Well, the tattoo you're referencing is, Luke 12:48, to whom much is given, much is expected, which is something my father used to say to me all the time. But, you grow up Catholic, duty is very much imprinted in the front of your mind. Men and women for others, service that, get in line, be the best version of yourself. And, my grandfather was a World War II veteran, as my dad's side, Big Russ, who's right there. And never went to college, worked 2 jobs, took care of his family. Just an incredibly nice, sweet man. Glass was always half full. But he, through his hard work and due diligence, taught my dad the value of showing up, taught my dad the value of being present and doing the best job that you can. And so my entire life, I had always been taught the value of work, diligent, hard work, and sort of saying no to that and saying, I'm just going to go travel with no real plan. People say, well, what would your dad think? I said, that would have freaked him out. You'd be happy with this, but that would have freaked him out. But that was radical for me because it felt to some degree, not betrayal, but I'm just going to do my own thing for a minute. I hope you're proud of me.
Did your mom think it was a good idea?
In the beginning, yeah. After
a
few years,
We'll talk about that too. So you started in Maine.
Californians are more laid back.
So you started in Maine. Why Maine?
Travels with Charlie. It's just, I think Maine for me was a place that I had not really spent time in the United States. And it was safe enough where I was like, okay, I'm going to do my own little solo drive around. I had the truck that my dad got me when I graduated from high school. I had my dog, this pug named Chamberlain at the time. He's named after the Civil War hero from Maine named Joshua Chamberlain. I love Civil War history. And it just seemed like a natural thing to do. And that's really where I realized in that trip that this is what I wanted to be doing. And the clarity and the peace that I got from just being an obscure traveling person in the middle of the deep backwoods of Maine. I write about in the book, I went through this working forest that had no marked roads, almost got killed by a timber truck. But that's where I wanted to be. And that's 3 weeks before the election. And everyone's talking about the election. And I'm happier in the deep woods of Maine, skipping rocks in the creeks and just breathing. And I knew there was a real value add to changing your physical environment. Because when the physical environment changed, the mental one did as well to a much better place.
So you traveled through 67 countries, I believe, over a 3-year period.
Yes.
I think you write about 20 different places in the book.
In my original draft, I wrote about all 67. But the publishers go, we don't publish War and Peace anymore.
I might not have picked up the book.
Yeah,
I don't know.
Good.
So I want to talk about some of them.
Please.
I want to get to the part about the emotional lessons in some sense that you learned. But tell us about Senegal.
So Senegal was a very special place for me. I wanted to go to Africa, and for me, I always associated Africa with the beauty of safari and the animals and all the rich images that had come across from the Lion King and National Geographic. But then the Catholic Jesuit trained kid in me was like, well, yeah, but also the slavery. You have to go learn about that. You have to go see that. You have to go where that occurred. In Western Africa, it was the major slave depot, and I believe slavery is America's mortal sin. I believe it has so much of what our makeup is today is what happened with that issue. And so I was very curious. I wanted to go as a historian, amateur historian. I wanted to go as a writer. I also wanted to go as a traveler. And I went to Senegal, and it's a Muslim country. There's a small Christian population, but primarily a Muslim country. And I met this driver, and he was a fascinating guy. And he took me all around, and there's an island which was really the base of the slave depot called Goree Island. And there's a door there that is called the door of no return. And that's the door where the slaves would walk through out onto the ship. And Pope John Paul II prayed there and started to cry. Nelson Mandela broke down there. President Bush broke down there. There's a lot of people who've cried at that door because it's very powerful and very intense. And I went over there, and it was one of these things where, in terms of travel, I had always associated water, teal blue water and sunlight dancing on top of the water with peace and comfort. And this time it wasn't. It was tragic and it was difficult. And that really resonated with me, in that it changed my view of the world, that sometimes you see things through the rose-colored lenses, and in fact, there's a lot more beyond that. And to be aware of that, it makes you a much more well-rounded, better person.
So tell us about Vietnam and Hanoi Hilton.
Oh my goodness. So like like many children of boomers, you hear a lot about Vietnam growing up. And I always felt that Vietnam just lived within our house. Both my parents were parts of the protest movement for Vietnam. My father went to John Carroll University, which is right down the street from Kent State. When Kent State happened, John Carroll, he took in a lot of kids from that school. And that was really something that inspired him to go into politics and understand that. My mother was a Peace Corps volunteer. She did marches on Washington. My aunt's actually here today, also marched against the war in Vietnam. And it was something, and I was always so fascinated by it because I felt that it shaped so much of the public discourse that I grew up with. And you get all those rich movies and the music, right? Like Creedence Clearwater and Apocalypse Now, like all my dad's favorites, and Bruce Springsteen, Born in the USA. So it was just like this place that had given so much and taken so much. And I said, none of my parents had never gone there. My dad had never gone. He was very happy. He didn't have to go. He had a high draft number. A lot of his friends went, and that was something that he goes, I never wanted to flunk out of school because I knew if I flunked out where I was going. And my mom had never been there in her travels. So I said, I'm going to go to Vietnam. And I go there expecting, this is what you see in the movies and whatnot. And it's the nicest people, the most beautiful culture. So much of it's modern. A lot of the times you walk through the streets of Hanoi, they love Americans and they go, please protect us from China, right? Like, and vice versa. And it had a real impact on me because I left there thinking, this didn't need to happen to this degree. And there's better ways forward through positive, dialogue and whatnot. But it was very strange to walk in these places that.
And you had a relationship with John McCain.
Yes, in the Hanoi Hilton. So to get to that thing, John McCain was the first politician I really, really deeply admired as a kid. And I was always struck by how he had the opportunity to leave this terrible prison, but never did. Because of who his father was, they offered him early release, and in exchange, as a measure of goodwill, and he said, no, we're going to go in the order of which people came. And so I had a desire to go see that prison, and it's absolutely terrible. It's a decrepit pit. It's horrific. And to see that in person, not only my admiration grew, but it also just really grew for people who take those types of positions, which is I'm not going to put myself above. I'm going to be someone who's dutiful.
So quickly tell us about Bolivia and Zimbabwe, because I thought both of those were fascinating.
So Bolivia is part of a Latin American jaunt that I do, which actually started off traveling with my mother, which was the greatest decision, the worst decision at the same time. But Bolivia, I was very fearful of going to because the capital, La Paz, is very high up. It's about 14,000 feet. And it's very hard to breathe up there. And I have hypoxia. I don't like high altitude. So it's very nice being a low desert here. And when I landed there, I just turned green. And it's not particularly good. And I went to this hotel and they had bottles of oxygen, and I just was sucking down the oxygen and drinking coca tea, which is the same leaf that they make cocaine out of, they make tea out of, and it helps with altitude. So I would never pass a drug test after drinking all those coca teas, just like this. But eventually, by about day 3, I acclimated. And it was an incredible experience because Bolivian culture is just so rich up in the mountains and whatnot. And there's these beautiful salt flats, too, where you can take these photographs. There's no depth perception, so they can put a plastic dinosaur behind you and it looks like you're running away from a dinosaur. So I had all these incredible experiences. But for me, that was something that was important because my father would never have done that. He would not have been comfortable at 14,000 feet up, and he would have been really freaked out.
Accomplished it.
And I accomplished it, and it meant a lot to me. And then Zimbabwe was something similar too. As I went to Zimbabwe, and I ended up in the middle of a coup that was happening. And thankfully, the coup was in the capital city, but I was in this tourist city called Victoria Falls, where the waterfalls are. And you wake up in the morning and there's a general on TV screaming and yelling, and you don't know what's happening, and no one at the hotel knew what was happening. And I had a friend who worked in the embassy in Harare, the capital, which I was supposed to visit. And I called him up. He goes, "If you can get out, I would really get out." And there's a bridge to Zambia, but that had been closed. But the airport was still open. And I had this cab driver who had given me a ride before, and we worked out a thing. And we got to the airport, and there wasn't a lot of people working at the airport, but the flights were still going out, and I was able to get out. That was another thing that instilled confidence, which was okay. Like I was here in a coup. I think my dad would have been really anxious and nervous. My mom, on the other hand, goes, "Take good notes. What an incredible experience." So, we made it.
So there's many more great experiences, but there's one that I think shows our age difference, and I don't even really know what this is. I'd never heard of it before till I read your book. It's called, and I don't even know if I'm going to pronounce this right, Ponchan 918.
Oh, that was a wild story.
I don't know if anyone else has ever heard about it here.
There's something I talk about in the book a little bit, which you honestly could do whole volumes on this now, but there's the real world that we live in, and then there's the other world that we live in, which is curated on your phone through social media and all these digital things. But there is this otter, like literally,
he said otter,
an animal otter,
sea otter,
like a river otter,
river otter.
That was famous in Japan that I had followed for a bunch of years on Instagram, and I went to Tokyo, and I went to this art show about the otter. And I, wrote on the wall of the otter, "I was at your art show. I wanted to meet you," just sort of jokingly. And the woman who is the owner of the otter, direct messaged me using Google Translate and was like, "Do you want to come meet the otter?" And so I went to her apartment in Tokyo, and I met the literal otter. And all done through Google Translate and everything. And that was just a surreal experience because I had followed this otter on Instagram for so many years. And I described in the book, it was like walking into the Seinfeld set. Like, I knew where the layout of her kitchen. I knew what room the otter was in. And that was something which was really weird, but incredibly enjoyable.
So I kind of want to switch for a second. You've traveled now for about 18 months. You've returned home. I want to talk about chapter 18. I think you call it the kitchen table conversation with your mother. Because for me, the tone of the book changes here.
Sure.
It becomes a little more dark, a little more depressing emotionally in some sense. So tell us about the kitchen table conversation.
Well, I think my mom, like most moms, the question comes, what the hell are you doing with your life, right? What's happening? And for me, I resented that at the time because my mother was so much of the inspiration for getting out and kind of being a trailblazer. And she broke a lot of glass ceilings as a young female reporter at Newsweek and then eventually at Vanity Fair. So my first reaction was, why are you coming at me with all of this? I'm having a great time. I'm learning so much about the world, and I'm learning so much about myself. But as moms tend to do, she also turned the stone over on the thing that was internally debilitating, which is, man, what am I doing with all of this? What is the point of this? Is this an exercise in vanity? Is there something more to be had from this experience? And once that happens, I sort of view the travels, and it's not like she was the catalyst for this. It had been happening. She just brought it up to the surface, which was, what is the point of these travels? Are you bettering yourself? Are you just doing this for the sake of doing it? Or are you doing it to escape something? And those were the hard questions that I had to grapple with, which I had touched here and there along the journey. But it was this sort of mix of interiority and reflection, but then also a dose of escapism. So after that happens, I say to my mom, "You will not stop me from traveling." And so I'm going to go even the most bare budget, hostile traveling around. And I keep going and going and going. But in my own mind, I go, "Okay, how am I going to land this plane? And what does this all mean? And is there a deeper meaning out there for me in this journey?"
Did you find that out?
I did. I don't want to spoil the ending because
So I want to read something again.
Please.
This is when you're in Abilene, and this is towards the end of the book, 229. And again, for me, the last chapters were actually the most compelling because, again, they were candid, they were emotional, they exposed your vulnerability. I mean, you were pretty honest about
that's what you're reading out on the page, and that's the hardest stuff to write. Yeah.
So you say, quote, "God, I look like shit. I don't even look like me anymore. This isn't what this journey was supposed to be about. This is pathetic and shameful bastardization. This isn't self-growth, and it's far, far away from self-care." So you pick one last place to go, the Holy Lands.
Yeah.
Why there? Why did you pick the Holy Lands?
Well, I'll go back to Abilene there. Abilene's a sort of flame out where I had been traveling at such a rate for so long, and I went to this place that served these Long Island iced tea drinks and just lost myself and ended up eating this cheeseburger and waking up in the morning just puffy and looking awful and feeling awful. And I was like, something's got to change. And it's after that when I decide, you know what, I want to write about this experience. And so from there, I take all these journals that I had kept and I start looking for meaning about the journey. And I decide I'm going to write about it. And I go to my grandmother's old apartment in San Francisco and start the writing process. And while I start the writing process, it's very healing, it's healthy living in the Bay Area, it's very nice. But I feel something missing. And when I realize it's missing is that through this entire journey I went, for someone who grew up in a very Catholic household, I had never gone to the Holy Land. And that's something I need to do. I need to go to the Middle East. I need to go to the Holy Land. So I kind of, I've been writing at this point for some time, and I think I have a good story, but it's kind of a travel story. But there's some interiority, but it's more of a travel story. And I go, all right, I have one last trip, and I want to see what I've learned in the writing process and what I've learned after all this travel. Let me apply it here and see. And then maybe there's some deeper meaning that shows itself in the Holy Land. Who knows? And what I end up doing is going all throughout the Middle East, but then ending up in Jerusalem. And for someone who grew up going to CCD, Sunday school, all these places that were in the Bible suddenly become real. There's the temptation on the Mount. Like, oh my gosh, there's Galilee. This is incredible. And what it led me to is real awakening about my own role as a son, my own role in life, and ultimately getting to a place where I was able to deal with the grief of losing my father and come out to a place where it was really a place of peace, and how I got there. And that all happens in the Holy Land. It's a good chapter.
So did you have an aha moment? Like, here's the answer. Here's a sign.
It's what ends up happening is I am in the tomb of Christ, and there's I had this tour throughout the time of you go to Bethlehem and you go through Jericho and you're seeing all these sites, and it's very heavy. And the Jerusalem in itself is an incredibly heavy place. I mean, this little town. It's like the size of this library, essentially, is the forefront of Islam and Judaism and Christianity. And all these people are going there with all of their hopes, dreams, fears, aspirations. Everything is in this little old city. And I went into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Christ's tomb, and I stood there and I just asked this question, like, why me? Why did I have this journey? Why did I have this life? Why have I had these experiences that are so unique that a lot of people might be happy to have one of them, and I seem to have had a million? What is this all about? And what am I doing? And there's a voice that says, you were heard. but you have to go out and be aware. I was like, what does that mean? Be aware, notice. And as I walk out, it's, Jerusalem, it's shutting down, and there's a guy on the street, and he's selling yarmulkes, and the first one is a Buffalo Bills yarmulke. And I said, okay. And so I got it, and I end up going to the wall. And I go to the Wailing Wall, and it's there where this clarity comes about. And it ultimately comes to this idea of, my own feeling that I'm enough. Because I think growing up, am I doing enough? Am I good enough? Am I as good as my parents? Am I giving as much as I can to the world with all this privilege? But then also coming to a place of where, if our lost loved ones had an opportunity to talk to us, I come to this realization that I think they would say, when we come up, don't cry, smile, be very happy for the time you had. And it's okay to live your own life. You don't have to think about me all the time. You don't have to carry me all the time. You can, I will always be with you, but go be you. Don't spend your entire life just missing me. And it takes a long time to get there, and some people never do. But for me, it was a culmination of that journey. I had to have that deeply personal internal journey around a lot of physical places to get to that place of healing.
So,
thank you.
So I'm not finished, but I wanted to make a comment because that's what this book is. It's emotional and it's candid and honest, just like you were right then. And you can hear the emotion in your voice. And I appreciate that because I know all this is probably still a little hard. So I want to ask, did you find out if you were looking for something or running from something?
I'm doing both. And what's interesting is that the book, those are two parallel tracks, because what I'm running away from, let me tell you what I'm searching for first. I'm searching for who I am independent of my last name, of my hometown, of the bubble, this world of which I have lived in. I know no other world. I know no other place. So I'm looking for that. Who are you aside from this? Who are you as Luke? What are you about when you don't have to play up for the President of the United States or carry the legacy of your dad or please your mother? Who are you stripped down to your studs? And then I'm also running away from something. And the running away is the grief. And you don't know that you're running away from grief sometimes. And then you kind of realize that, you've been avoiding situations, or you chalk things, you have this anxiety for different moments of the day. You have these feelings that are deeply uncomfortable and you don't know what they are. You have moments where you're just so sad and you don't know what it is. And I'm not depressed. I'm anxious sometimes, but what is that? And that's the grief. And that's the impending weight of grief. And I tell people, I go, it never really fully goes away, but you get to a point of where you understand why it's present and you embrace it. And for me, I've been able to get to that, but it's really hard. And those were the two parallel tracks. It was searching for something, my own identity, but also running away from something. So that's grieving my father and finding myself.
So your dad, who wrote Big Russ and Me, ended his book about his dad, your grandfather, with a letter to you. And I wanted to quote one part of it. It says, "You do, however, owe this world something. To live a good and decent and meaningful life would be the ultimate affirmation of what Grandpa's lessons and values." And you, closing your book, wrote a letter to your dad. Did you find that decency and that meaning?
It's very interesting you bring up my dad's letter, because for a lot of years, those words were hard. Not go live a decent life. That is something we all should be striving to do. But if you read the letter, there's to some degree this sort of projection of you really need to do this because of all the hard work that has come before you. And that's a hard thing to shoulder sometimes, especially as a young man, especially with your North Star, your guiding light is gone. So you feel the pressure more. And for a long time, that letter was hard for me. But after I wrote my book and I reflected on it, I got to a place of, I understand what the old man was saying.
And
I respond to a degree. Yeah.
so I was going to end this with what's next.
Oh, yeah.
What's next for Luke?
Well, I love the storytelling space, and they want me to do another one, but it's really hard to do another one. So hopefully I would write another book, but I won't promise that today. I took this new job where I'm hosting these live events for MSNBC, which has been fun. We did our first one in Washington on Monday. And I like that because I'm learning a lot about putting on live events like this and the value add in gathering again. I think when you put people in a room together and you have solutions-based conversations, a lot of interesting things happen, and you learn so much. I hope from an experience like this, you would learn a lot more than you would from like a 20-minute TV interview. They're not even 20 minutes anymore. A 2-minute TV interview, right? So you learn something. So I'm working on that now, but I'm always drawn to the storytelling space. I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other, and there's a lot that we can learn from within stories that really bring out the commonalities of the shared human experience, and that's a space that I like to live in and contribute towards.
So in the last minute that we have, what would you want the takeaway to be from your book?
Oh, that's a good question. Well, number one is that it was good. Because I'll tell you, one of the things that has made me laugh is book readers, they're a lot harder than TV viewers. So when you work in TV, you meet someone like, oh, I love you on camera, and it's very superficial, like, oh, hello. Whereas a lot of readers are like, well, I really liked it. In chapter 12, you kind of lost me there. That was bad, blah, blah, blah. So that was a nice adjustment. But it's something that I heard a lot on this book tour is, well, I don't usually buy books written by TV people because they're really bad, but yours was good. It was well written. So and I'm like, no, I wasn't on TV anymore. I spent 7 years away. Like, I don't want to carry that. So the first thing is, people would say, well, what are you? I say first, I'm an author. I'm an Emmy Award-winning journalist, but I'm an author. I'm so proud of being an author. But to me, I wrote the book just with a very simple concept, and that was that if it never sold well and it ended up in the bargain book bin of an Exxon, if some kid who lost their dad found it and felt a little less lost, then I knew I had done my job. And what I've been amazed by is that I get so many letters and so many notes, and they continue to this day. And I was really thinking I was writing for a younger audience, or an audience in my generation, but it turned out the audience that really, really got to this book was an older one. And I'm so thankful for that. But I've gotten letters from people as old as 96, 97 that have been like, I still struggle with losing a parent. It's been 60 years. And it's determined so much of how my life has ended up and where I am. And people also saying, I was very fearful about changing the direction of life, and I never did. But thank you that you did, because I felt like I got to live that experience. So that's been the biggest takeaway for me, is having that shared experience with people and folks reading the book and being like, yeah, grief takes time. It's not easy. And sometimes you need a moment to figure out your direction in life, and you don't have all the answers, and that's okay too. And just get to that place where ultimately at the end of the day, you're not hurting anybody, and you're not hurting yourself, and you're living a good and decent life. And that's really the best you can do.